Kendrick Robinson glanced at the clock. 8:42 a.m. He parked his car outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse, the South Carolina sun casting sharp shadows over the pavement. Exhaling deeply, he braced himself. He despised being late. As a federal prosecutor, punctuality was paramount. Yet this morning had unraveled beyond his control. What should have been a simple errand disputing an unjust property tax increase on the home his late grandmother had left him had turned into a frustrating ordeal. The house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the foundation of his childhood, a place of warmth and guidance. He had spent weeks assembling proof that the city had made an error, determined to protect its legacy. Dressed impeccably in a navy suit and crisp white shirt, Kendrick embodied professionalism. Despite the chaos of his morning, an urgent call regarding an ongoing human trafficking case had thrown off his schedule. The defense had filed a last-minute motion demanding his immediate attention. He had reviewed and responded before rushing to court, hoping to make it in time. His phone buzzed as he approached the courthouse steps. A message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Judge Whitman doesn't tolerate tardiness. Be careful. He sighed, tucking the phone away. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he was armed with evidence. Still, something about the message lingered in his mind. Shaking it off, he entered the courthouse, its cool air a stark contrast to the heat outside. The municipal court lacked the grandeur of federal courtrooms. The beige walls were dull, the seats worn from years of use, the faint scent of old paper and coffee hanging in the air. Yet, the place buzzed with anxious energy, citizens clutching documents, voices hushed over minor legal battles. A glance at his watch, 8:50 a.m. He had barely enough time to find the right courtroom. Navigating the narrow hallway, he followed the signs until he reached room 204. The brass plaque bore the name, Judge Charles Whitman. Adjusting his tie, he stepped inside. The room was filling quickly. He took a seat near the back, flipping open his folder to review his case. As he skimmed through his documents, he noticed the judge entering. Judge Charles Whitman was a commanding, presentable, silver-haired, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room with a practiced intensity. The weight of his reputation preceded him, a no-nonsense enforcer of courtroom order. He was not one to indulge excuses. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood as one, Kendrick included. The judge took his seat, and silence followed. The cases moved swiftly. Each litigant called and dealt with in quick succession. A middle-aged man in a suit arrived late but went unnoticed. A young woman in casual attire slipped in minutes later, similarly ignored. Kendrick noted the disparity, but for now, his focus remained on his own case. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the bailiff called his name. He rose, exuding composure as he approached the podium. Judge Whitman barely glanced at his documents before speaking. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." The words cut through the room, sharp and unwavering. Kendrick felt the shift in the air, the quiet scrutiny of down scenes of eyes. "Do you believe this court's time is less valuable than your own?" the judge continued, his gaze unwavering. Kendrick raised a hand in acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses do not excuse tardiness. This court operates on discipline. If you cannot adhere to that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities." Kendrick maintained his composure. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of punctuality. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding—" Judge Whitman waved a dismissive hand. "We'll get to that. First, the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines this court's integrity. You are hereby fined $750. The words echoed in the silent room, each syllable a gavel striking an anvil. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but he showed no outward reaction. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured. "May I explain?" The judge's gavel struck the bench. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back, his mind already racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. Something deeper was at play. He glanced at the other latecomers, none of whom had been penalized. That disparity was undeniable. Returning to his seat, he opened his folder, but this time, he wasn't reviewing property tax documents. Instead, he picked up a pen and began writing. The judge continued calling cases, but Kendrick was no longer just another name on the docket. This morning had taken a turn, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Kendrick Saturday in the back row, his mind a flurry of calculations and observations. The courtroom continued its monotonous rhythm, yet he couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment in his head. $750 fine imposed on him versus the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier was now seated near the front, casually scrolling through her phone. The man in the gray blazer, who had clearly arrived after court had started, was presenting his case without a single reprimand. Patterns. Kendrick had spent his career identifying them, piecing together evidence that often revealed systemic failures, and this was no different. The realization settled in his gut like a lead weight. This wasn't just an isolated moment of judicial frustration. It was part of something larger, something Kendrick had seen before. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme. He noted the expressions of those around him, whispers, subtle glances, the collective unease that only occurred when something unjust had unfolded. Kendrick could see it in their eyes. They were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak up. Next case, Judge Whitman announced. Kendrick's name echoed through the room again. He stood, his stride calm and deliberate, making his way back to the podium. The judge's piercing gaze locked onto him, daring him to falter. Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice steady, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. This property has been in my family for decades, and the new assessment does not align with the city's previous valuations. He opened his folder, displaying a series of neatly organized documents. He gestured toward a specific page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment reflects a 30% increase, without prior notification or proper explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. I will review this in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness remains an issue that must be addressed. Kendrick maintained his composure. Your Honor, I was delayed due to an urgent federal case involving human trafficking. I trust we all agree that such matters warrant immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed. Your priorities, however noble, do not justify disregarding this court's rules. Procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Kendrick, it was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that no explanation he provided would be deemed sufficient. His professional credentials, his dedication, even his respect for the system, none of it mattered here. He took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, he said carefully, I fully understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask here these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom. A ripple of tension passed through the room. The judge stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? Kendrick met the judge's gaze evilly. I am asking for clarity, he replied. It is crucial to ensure that fairness is upheld not just for myself, but for everyone here. The judge's gavel came down sharply. I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Kendrick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. Some held quiet admiration, others uncertainty, but all had seen what had transpired. This wasn't the first time Kendrick had encountered bias disguised as authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was shifting. People were paying attention. As he sat down, He pulled out his phone and began typing notes. He wasn't doing it by a long shot. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger. Kendrick Saturday still, his pen moving swiftly across the page, documenting everything, judge's words, the disparities, the reactions of those in the room. He had built his career on exposing injustices, and today, he had seen enough to know that something wasn't right. The tension from his exchange with Judge Whitman still lingered in the air, thick and palpable. The room had settled back into its routine, but Kendrick could feel the undercurrent of unease. He noticed a man arose. Ahead of him, a distinguished-looking older gentleman glanced back at him with a knowing expression. He wasn't alone in what he had observed. The judge continued moving through cases with a cold efficiency, issuing fines and rulings with little room for discussion. Kendrick listened closely, catching subtle patterns in the judge's tone and decisions. The harsher penalties were almost exclusively reserved for Black and Latino defendants, while white defendants received softer reprimands or minor fees. The pattern was undeniable, yet so routine that most people probably accepted it without question. But Kendrick wasn't most people. The judge called the next case, and Kendrick shifted his focus. A young black man stepped forward, his hands trembling as he clutched a stack of papers. "State your name," Judge Whitman commanded. "Devin Harris, Your Honor." His voice wavered slightly, but he stood tall. "In the nature of your case." "I'm contesting a fine, sir. My landlord made repairs to my apartment, but he passed the costs on to me. I have documents proving I wasn't responsible." Judge Whitman took the papers with an air of disinterest, flipping through them without much examination. Kendrick watched closely, noting the way the judge barely skimmed the evidence before shaking his head. "Mr. Harris, the law is clear. You are responsible for any costs incurred on your property, regardless of circumstances. The fine stands." Devin opened his mouth as if to argue, but quickly thought better of it. Shoulders sagging, he gave a defeated nod. "That was it." Kendrick couldn't stay silent. "Your Honor, if I may," Kendrick interjected, standing. The judge's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his face. "Mr. Robinson, you have already had your time in this courtroom. Sit down." "With all due respect, Your Honor, I am simply asking whether Mr. Harris's evidence was fully considered." Judge Whitman's jaw tightened. "Are you implying that I do not review cases fairly?" "I'm suggesting that clarity and transparency are essential for justice," Kendrick replied smoothly. "And from where I sit, it appears certain cases are dismissed with far less scrutiny than others." A murmur rippled through the room. Devin Harris turned slightly, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Others, too, shifted in their seats, as if suddenly realizing that someone was willing to challenge the status quo. The judge's face darkened. "I will not have my courtroom questioned by someone who refuses to abide by its rules." Kendrick met his gaze, unwavering. "And I cannot abide by a system that enforces rules unequally." The silence stretched, the weight of the moment pressing down on the entire room. Finally, Judge Whitman let out a slow, measured breath. "Mr. Harris, I will take another look at your documents." The young man hesitated, as if unsure whether he had heard correctly. He handed the judge the papers once more. This time, Whitman took a longer pause, his eyes scanning the evidence with slightly more care. Kendrick knew he hadn't won anything yet, but he had shifted something, cracked the veneer of unquestioned authority, and sometimes all it took was a single spark to ignite change. As his Saturday backed down, Kendrick felt the eyes of the courtroom on him. He wasn't done here, not by a long shot. As Kendrick Saturday back in his chair, he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, like a string pulled tight, ready to snap. He had challenged Judge Whitman, not aggressively, but just enough to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of those present. For the first time that morning, The judge appeared momentarily unsettled. It was a small crack in an otherwise impenetrable facade, but Kendrick knew from experience that even the smallest crack could expand under the right pressure. He watched as Judge Whitman slowly flipped through Devin Harris's documents. His usual air of disinterest somewhat diminished. It was performative, Kendrick was certain, an attempt to regain control over the situation, but it was a sign that the judge wasn't completely immune to scrutiny. The room had grown still, as if everyone inside held their breath. Devin Harris shifted on his feet, clutching his hands together as though trying to steady himself. The young man had come prepared, and yet he had nearly been dismissed without so much as a second glance. Kendrick's pulse thrummed in his ears. How many others had stood in this very spot, their voices ignored, their evidence disregarded? How many had left this courtroom carrying the weight of injustice, believing they never had a chance to begin with? Judge Whitman finally looked up. It appears there was a discrepancy in the filing, he said, his tone clipped. The property management company failed to provide sufficient documentation of the charge. Mr. Harris, your fine is dismissed. A small, startled gasp came from Devin. As though he hadn't quite dared to hope for this outcome, Kendrick remained silent, letting the moment settle in. This court is adjourned for recess, Judge Whitman announced, striking his gavel a little too forcefully. He stood and left the bench without another glance at Kendrick. As the room began to empty, Kendrick noticed people lingering, whispering in hushed tones. He locked eyes with the older man who had been observing him earlier. The man gave him a slight nod of approval before turning to leave. Kendrick gathered his things, but before he could exit, Devin Harris approached him, hesitating. Mr. Robinson, he said, voice quiet but firm. Thank you. You don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up. Kendrick offered a reassuring smile. You had the truth on your side. It just needed someone to make sure it was heard. Devin nodded, exhaling in relief. I guess people like me don't always get the chance. That's what we're here to change, Kendrick replied. As Kendrick stepped out of the courtroom into the bright South Carolina morning, he felt the weight of what had just happened settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't over. One small victory didn't dismantle an entire system. But ripples had started, and ripples, given time, could turn into waves. Kendrick walked down the courthouse steps, the morning sun glaring against the pavement, the weight of the previous hour Saturday heavy on his shoulders. He had seen systemic injustices play out before, but today, he had become part of the narrative in a way he hadn't anticipated. The tension in the courtroom, the way the judge had reacted, and the barely veiled curiosity of the spectators, everything told him this was only the beginning. As he reached his car, he pulled out his phone and sent a message to Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We need to talk. He didn't need to elaborate. Julia was sharp enough to understand the urgency in his words. By the time Kendrick returned to his office, an email from Julia was already waiting in his inbox. Come in, now. Kendrick set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. He knew this conversation was going to be significant. Julia Harper was a no-nonsense attorney, a woman who had built her career on dismantling corruption and ensuring justice prevailed. If there was anyone who could help him navigate the road ahead, it was her. Stepping into Julia's office, Kendrick closed the door behind him. She sat behind her desk, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, scanning a document. Without looking up, she said, I assume this has to do with your court appearance this morning. Kendrick sat across from her. Yes, and it's bigger than I expected. Julia finally looked up, her sharp eyes locking onto his. Explain. He recounted everything: judge's blatant dismissal of the evidence, the disproportionate treatment of Black and Latino defendants compared to their white counterparts, the moment he challenged Whitman's decisions, and the undeniable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. When he finished, Julia exhaled slowly, removing her glasses. You realize what you've done, don't you? Kendrick nodded. I didn't plan on confronting him, but I couldn't just let it slide. Julia leaned forward. You exposed something, whether Whitman likes it or not. That courtroom was watching. People noticed. I know, Kendrick admitted, and I don't think this is an isolated incident. Julia sat her back in her chair, crossing her arms. I assume you want to dig deeper. I need to, Kendrick confirmed. If this is a pattern, we can't ignore it. She tapped her fingers against the desk, considering. We'll need hard evidence, more than just observations from one day. If we're going to challenge a sitting judge, we have to build an airtight case. Kendrick had already anticipated this. I'll start gathering data court transcripts, records of sentencing disparities, fine distributions, anything that points to a systemic issue. Julia nodded. Good, but be careful, Kendrick. Judges don't like their authority questioned. And Whitman, he strikes me as the kind of man who won't let this go quietly. Kendrick met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes. Neither will I. By the next morning, Kendrick had assembled a preliminary team of research assistants and an investigator from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Their first step was combing through municipal court records, looking for any patterns of racial disparity in Judge Whitman's rulings. Hours passed as Kendrick sifted through data. The results were more damning than he had anticipated. Over the last 5 years, black defendants were fined an average of 300 more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals by white defendants were ignored, while black defendants faced harsh penalties. Requests for leniency payment plans, community service in lieu of fines were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. Kendrick leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It's worse than I thought. One of his assistants, a young woman named Brianna, nodded grimly. And this is just the beginning. We've only scratched the surface. Their next step was gathering first-hand accounts. Kendrick reached out to defense attorneys, legal aid workers, and even former defendants who had appeared in Whitman's court. The responses were overwhelming. A public defender named Carlos Ortiz shared his frustration. I've been fighting against his rulings for years. The bias is blatant, but it's hard to challenge a judge without solid proof. If you're serious about this, you have my full support. A young black woman, arrested for a minor parking violation, recounted her humiliating experience in Whitman's courtroom. It treated me like I was a criminal. I was scared to even speak up. A white defendant, who had faced a similar charge, told a starkly different story. He let me off with a warning, said it wasn't worth the court's time. Kendrick documented every testimony, every inconsistency. The picture was becoming clear. This wasn't just bias. This was a systemic abuse of power. As he compiled his findings, he received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but it picked up. Kendrick Robinson, a voice asked. Yes, who's this? The caller hesitated before answering. I work at the courthouse. I can't say much over the phone, but I have something you want to say. Meet me tomorrow. The coffee shop across from the courthouse. 8 a.m. The line went dead. Kendrick stared at his phone, adrenaline kicking in. Someone from inside the courthouse was willing to talk. That meant there was more to uncover. He glanced at his notes, then at the clock. This was only the beginning, and now the storm was coming. The next morning, Kendrick arrived at the small coffee shop across from the courthouse, his eyes scanning the crowded room. The scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, but he barely noticed it. His focus was singular. Whoever had called him last night had information he needed, and he wasn't about to waste this opportunity. He spotted a woman sitting in the corner, her posture tense, her eyes darting around as if afraid of being watched. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a modest blue cardigan, her salt and pepper hair neatly pinned back. When she saw Kendrick approach, she straightened, but he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. You're Kendrick Robinson, she asked as he sat her down across from her. He nodded. And you are? She hesitated, then took a steadying breath. My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm the senior clerk at the municipal courthouse. Kendrick's pulse quickened. A courthouse insider. This was bigger than he had anticipated. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice. I've worked under Judge Whitman for 15 years. I know what he's done. I've seen the way he treats people, the way he manipulates cases to get the outcomes he wants. But I've been too afraid to speak up, until now. Kendrick kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. What do you have? Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She slid it across the table. I've kept records, dates, case numbers, discrepancies, things that didn't sit right with me. I didn't have anywhere to take it before, but after what you did in court the other day, I knew it was time. Kendrick picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Case after case, all meticulously recorded instances of Black and Latino defendants receiving higher fines. Cases dismissed for white defendants under suspicious circumstances. Defense attorneys shut down before they could present their arguments. This is, he exhaled, shaking his head. This is exactly what we need. Margaret nodded. I can get you more. There are digital records too. Documents I'm not supposed to access, but I know where to look. Kendrick studied her, noting the determination in her eyes. If you help me, Whitman will know someone from the inside spoke out. Are you prepared for that? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I've spent years watching him ruin lives. If I stay silent now, I'm no better than him. Kendrick reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Then we do this together. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Margaret smuggled out files, scanning documents, and emailing Kendrick encrypted copies. Kendrick and his team cross-referenced her records with the municipal court's publicly available data, solidifying the disparities they had suspected. It was worse than even Kendrick had imagined. Whitman's sentencing disparities weren't just frequent, they were systemic. Minority defendants were 3 times more likely to be denied leniency than their white counterparts. Fines for similar offenses varied wildly, favoring those with wealth and connections. The patterns weren't subtle, they were deliberate. One evening, as Kendrick sat in his office poring over the latest set of documents, his phone rang. It was Julia. I just read your latest findings, she said without preamble. Kendrick, this is damning. I know. There was a pause. Are you ready for what happens next? Kendrick leaned back in his chair. I don't think it matters if I am. This has to come out. Julia sighed. All right, I'll start preparing the formal complaint for the Judicial Review Commission. But Kendrick, be careful. If Whitman catches wind of this before we move, he'll do everything in his power to shut it down. I know, Kendrick said, which is why we're moving fast. The plan was set into motion. Julia filed the complaint with the state's Judicial Review Commission, submitting Kendrick's findings and Margaret's records as evidence. At the same time, Kendrick reached out to select journalists, ensuring that once the complaint was published, there would be no way for Whitman to quietly sweep it under the rug. And then, they waited. It took 2 days before the news broke. Federal Prosecutor alleges systemic bias in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The headline dominated local news. Articles detailed the allegations, outlining Kendrick's findings with shocking clarity. Margaret's notes were cited, her years of observations lending credibility to the growing case against Whitman. The courthouse buzzed with tension. Kendrick could feel it the moment he walked through the doors. Some clerks avoided eye contact, while others whispered as it passed. The bailiff, James Wilson, gave him a knowing note in acknowledgement that change was finally coming. Kendrick was in his office, reviewing the latest media coverage when his phone rang again. He picked up. Robinson. A familiar, icy voice came through the receiver. Mr. Robinson, I trust you've enjoyed your moment in the spotlight. Kendrick's grip on the phone tightened. Judge Whitman, you think you can bring me down with a few accusations and some cherry-picked data? The judge's voice was controlled, but Kendrick could hear the barely contained fury beneath it. You don't know who you're dealing with. Kendrick's expression didn't change. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I know exactly what you've done. There was a pause, then a quiet, dangerous chuckle. We'll see about that. The line went dead. Kendrick set the phone down and exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance. He had anticipated Whitman's anger, but the way the judge had spoken, the veiled threat in his words sent a chill down Kendrick's spine. This was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was a battle for justice itself. And Kendrick Robinson wasn't backing down. The fallout from the allegations against Judge Whitman was immediate and relentless. Within hours of the news breaking, local activists, defense attorneys, and even some former defendants flooded social media with their own stories. Hashtags like Justice for Greenville and Whitman Exposed began trending, turning the local controversy into a statewide discussion on judicial bias. Kendrick scrolled through the messages and testimonies that poured in. Some were from people who had faced similar injustices in Whitman's courtroom and fair fines, unreasonably harsh sentencing, dismissive treatment. Others came from concerned citizens who had long suspected corruption but had lacked proof. Now, thanks to Kendrick and Margaret, the proof was undeniable. Margaret remained in the shadows for now, her identity protected under whistleblower confidentiality. But Kendrick knew that wouldn't last. The closer they got to holding Whitman accountable, the more desperate the judge would become to discredit and silence them. As Kendrick walked into the office that morning, Julia was already waiting for him, arms crossed, brows furrowed. It's spreading faster than we anticipated, she said, gesturing toward her laptop screen, which displayed a news broadcast about the case. We need to be ready for retaliation. Kendrick nodded. Whitman called me last night. Julia's eyes widened. What did he say? He tried to intimidate me, Kendrick said, setting his briefcase down. Made it clear he won't go down without a fight. Julia exhaled sharply. Then we need to move fast. The Judicial Review Commission has formally launched an inquiry. If we can gather more statements from people affected by his rulings, we can build an even stronger case. Kendrick sat her down and tapped his fingers against the desk. I've already started compiling witness statements, but we need more than testimonies. We need undeniable proof of misconduct. As if on cue, Kendrick's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Meet me at the library on Jefferson Street. I have something for you. Come along. Kendrick frowned, showing the message to Julia. This could be dangerous, she warned. You don't know who this is. I don't, Kendrick admitted, but if they have something that can help us, I can't ignore it. An hour later, Kendrick arrived at the library, scanning the quiet rows of bookshelves for the source of the message. He spotted a figure seated near the back, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and tired eyes. You Kendrick Robinson? The man asked as Kendrick approached. I am, Kendrick replied. And you are? The man hesitated before speaking. James Wilson. I've been a bailiff in Whitman's court for 15 years. Kendrick's interest piqued. A courthouse insider. You said you had something for me. Wilson slid a flash drive across the table. Court transcripts, case records, internal memos. I copied what I could over the years. Didn't know what to do with it to know now. Kendrick picked up the flash drive, turning it in his fingers. What's in here? Proof, Wilson said, his voice low. Whitman has been rigging cases for years, favoring people with connections, handing out harsher sentences to minorities, bending the law whenever it suited him. You expose this, and he's done. Kendrick clenched his jaw. This was what they needed. Concrete, irrefutable evidence. Why are you coming for it now? Kendrick asked. Wilson's eyes darkened. Because I've watched good people get torn apart in that courtroom. People who didn't deserve it. And I'm tired of standing by. Kendrick nodded, appreciating the weight of Wilson's words. You know this makes you a target. I know, Wilson admitted, but it's the right thing to do. Kendrick reached out and shook his hand. "Then let's do it." Back at the office, Kendrick and his team pored over the files Wilson had provided. What they found was staggering. There were emails between Whitman and certain high-profile attorneys discussing leniency for specific clients, cases where defendants with personal connections to the judge mysteriously had their charges dropped, internal memos where Whitman explicitly instructed his clerks to impose harsher fines on certain individuals. "This is the smoking gun," Brianna, one of Kendrick's research assistants, whispered. "This isn't just bias. This is corruption." Julia leaned forward, scanning the documents. "We take this to the Judicial Review Commission first thing tomorrow. This is more than enough to have him removed from the bench." Kendrick exhaled, his mind racing. They were closer than ever to bringing Whitman down, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. His phone buzzed again, another unknown number. "You're making a mistake, Robinson. Drop this now, or you regret it." Kendrick stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Julian noticed his expression. "What is it?" He handed her the phone, and she read the message, her expression hardening. "He's getting desperate." Kendrick nodded, determination solidifying in his chest. "Then we're doing something right." The walls around Judge Whitman were closing in, and Kendrick was going to make sure there was no way out. The weight of the latest threat lingered in Kendrick's mind, but he pushed it aside. There was no turning back now. Judge Whitman's days of unchecked power were numbered, and Kendrick was going to make sure of it. The next morning, he and Julia arrived at the State Judicial Review Commission's headquarters with a secured briefcase containing every damning piece of evidence they had gathered. Brianna and the rest of the team stayed behind, monitoring news coverage and any developing responses from Whitman's camp. Inside the commission's offices, a panel of 5 members sat behind a long wooden table, their expressions stern and unreadable. Kendrick had faced intense scrutiny in court before, but this was different. This wasn't just about a cassette. This was about taking down a sitting judge. "Mr. Robinson, Ms. Harper," one of the commissioners, an older woman with piercing eyes, began. "You've brought forth serious allegations against Judge Charles Whitman. Do you have the evidence to support your claims?" Kendrick exchanged a glance with Julia before opening the briefcase. He pulled out printed court transcripts, case files, and the whistleblower statements. "Not only do we have witness testimonies from multiple sources, but we've also obtained internal documents that confirm a pattern of misconduct." He passed the documents forward. The commissioners leafed through them, their expressions tightening as they read. One of them, a man with graying temples, sighed. "This is extensive." He lifted a particular memo signed by Whitman himself, detailing sentencing disparities between white and minority defendants. "If these documents are verified, this is beyond a bias. This is systemic corruption." Julia leaned forward. "We have digital copies and backups of every document, and we've corroborated the data with state court records. Judge Whitman has abused his authority for years, and the people of Greenville have suffered because of it." The room fell silent for a long moment before the lead commissioner nodded. "We will begin a formal review immediately. If Judge Whitman is found guilty of misconduct, he will be removed from the bench." A surge of satisfaction coursed through Kendrick, but he knew this was just the beginning. The investigation would take time, and Whitman wasn't going down quietly. Later that evening, Kendrick sat in his office, scanning the latest reports. The news had broken that the Judicial Review Commission was investigating Whitman, and already public reaction was pouring in. His phone rang. "Julia, you need to turn on Channel 5, she said. "Now." Kendrick grabbed the remote and flipped the TV to the local news. His stomach clenched as he saw Whitman himself standing at a podium, flanked by his lawyers and supporters. His face was as composed as ever, but Kendrick could see the cracks in his demeanor. "This so-called investigation is nothing more than a politically motivated attack on my character," Whitman said, his voice unwavering. I have served this community for decades, and I will not be bullied by baseless accusations. A reporter's voice cut in. Judge Whitman, what do you say to the evidence that suggests a pattern of racial discrimination in your courtroom? Whitman barely hesitated. Those claims are fabricated. My record speaks for itself. Kendrick narrowed his eyes. The judge wasn't just denying the allegations, he was positioning himself as the victim. This was a calculated move, one meant to sway public opinion in his favor. His phone buzzed again this time. A text from Brianna. We just got word from one of our sources. Whitman is planning to file a countersuit against you. Kendrick let out a slow breath. Of course he is. Julia's voice came back through the phone. This is his play. He wants to paint himself as the real victim, discredit you before the commission finishes its investigation. He's grasping at straws, Kendrick said, but he knew they had to be prepared. Whitman had resources, influence, and allies who would fight to protect him. The coming days would be a battle. The next morning, Kendrick met with his legal team. Julia had already drafted a response to the anticipated countersuit, outlining how the evidence against Whitman was based on factual data, not personal vendettas. If it files, we'll counter with a public statement, Julia said. We'll also request an expedited review of the case. The sooner the commission reaches a verdict, the less damage it can do. As they finalized their strategy, Kendrick's phone buzzed again. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A low voice came through the line. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Robinson. Kendrick sat up straighter. Who is this? Silence. Then, a quiet chuckle. I'd hate to see a promising career ruined over a little courtroom dispute. The line went dead. Julia saw the look on his face. Another threat. Kendrick nodded. They're getting desperate. Julia exhaled, which means we're getting close. Kendrick set his phone down, determination solidifying in his chest. Whitman was playing his last cards, but it wouldn't be enough. The walls were closing in on him, and Kendrick was going to make sure there was no way out. Kendrick Saturday in his office, his eyes fixed on the latest news updates flashing across his screen. The walls were closing in on Judge Whitman, and the city of Greenville was watching. Reports on the investigation dominated headlines. Interviews with former defendants exposed years of discrimination, and the pressure mounted with every passing hour. But Kendrick knew better than to celebrate too soon. This was the moment when people like Whitman fought back the hardest. His phone buzzed. Julia. We just got confirmation, she said without preamble. Whitman has been formally suspended, pending the outcome of the Judicial Review Commission's investigation. Kendrick exhaled slowly. It was a major step forward, but it wasn't over. Has he responded? Oh, he's responding, Julia said darkly. His attorneys are making statements, calling this a witch hunt. They're spinning it as an attack on his career. Kendrick expected this. It was Whitman's last chance to salvage his reputation, but the evidence was undeniable. We need to keep pushing forward. Have we locked in the testimonies? Yes, several former defendants have agreed to testify, and there's more. Julia hesitated before continuing. Margaret found something else in the courthouse records. Financial transactions linked to Whitman's discretionary fines. It looks like he may have been profiting off the excessive penalties. Kendrick's jaw tightened. Bribery. Or something close to it, Julia confirmed. It explains why he was so eager to impose high fines on certain defendants. Some of that money never made it where it was supposed to. Kendrick leaned back in his chair, the weight of the case settling on him. Then we need to get this to the right people. The next morning, Kendrick met with state prosecutors. With financial corruption now in the mix, Whitman's case had moved beyond just misconduct. It was potentially criminal. The prosecutors listened intently as Kendrick laid out the findings, their expressions grim. This is enough to indict, one of them said. We'll need to move quickly. And move quickly they did. Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Whitman's arrest. The moment the news broke, the courthouse steps became a media circus. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the city buzzed with anticipation. Kendrick stood outside, watching as Judge Charles Whitman, man who had Saturday on the bench for decades, was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. For years, he had wielded power over the lives of countless individuals, but today, justice had finally turned its eyes on him. Even with Whitman arrested, Kendrick knew this wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was about an entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. Over the following weeks, Kendrick and his team worked with legal advocates and policymakers to push for reforms. Their efforts led to sweeping changes: mandatory bias training for judges, stricter oversight on courtroom practices, and a commitment to reviewing past cases handled by Whitman. One afternoon, Kendrick received an unexpected visit in his office. It was James Wilson, the bailiff who had provided key documents against Whitman. "I just wanted to thank you," Wilson said, his voice steady but emotional. "A lot of us saw what was happening for years, but we felt powerless to stop it. You changed that." Kendrick shook his hand. "None of this would have happened without people like you and Margaret stepping up. You had the courage to speak out." Wilson nodded, then chuckled. "You know, some of the clerks started calling you the Reckoner." Kendrick raised an eyebrow. "The Reckoner?" Wilson grinned. "Because you made sure justice caught up to the ones who thought they were untouchable." Kendrick chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just doing my job." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Months later, Kendrick found himself back at the courthouse. But this time, the air was different. The tension that had once clung to the walls like an unspoken truth had lifted. A new judge had been appointed, someone with a reputation for fairness and integrity. As Kendrick stood outside, he spotted a familiar figure: Devin Harris, the young man whose case had first sparked his confrontation with Whitman. "Mr. Robinson," Devin said, smiling, "I heard about everything that happened. I just wanted to say thank you." Kendrick shook his hand. "You're the reason I started looking deeper. Your case wasn't just about a fine, it was about justice." Devin nodded. "I'm going to law school next year. I want to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." Kendrick felt a swell of pride. This was why he fought, not for headlines or accolades, but for change. Real change that tripled being one courtroom. As he walked down the courthouse steps, Kendrick knew the fight for justice would never be over. But today, at least, the scales had been balanced a little more. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. Have a wonderful day.